Well, thanks once again for tuning in to Morning Live. Now, today is the first day, the first of 2 days of the Job Summit that kicks off in Midrand, north of Johannesburg. Government has invited business, labour and community organisations to look into ways of creating jobs that will change the livelihoods of most citizens in the country, where about 9 million people are without work. Pooe, who is a lecturer at the University of the Northwest and also Public Policy Analyst, joins me now to discuss this further. TK, thanks for coming through once again.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start here. Firstly, what is this Job Summit? What's its objective? And who are the main actors?
Oh, when I read the concept notes, the three main objectives coming through it is supposed to be trying to find the solutions to the mass unemployment we have. Secondly, trying to actually look at policy and institutions currently which are in place, which either hinder or need to maybe be stimulated in order to actually make the first objective become a reality. And three, which I think is probably going to be most difficult, actually writing up a new plan to move forward on how to make this happen. In theory, it's supposed to be government, business and labour, but as we know, not everyone seems to have been invited to this summit or this gathering.
So, interesting, as you say, not everyone seems to have been invited. Who do you think is lacking from that list?
I think in all these... I think these types of imbizos, we always forget people that are actually unemployed, like you've talked about, the 9 to 10 million. And I think that's always the people that seem to be forgotten in this whole thing. And now I'm not saying you should now invite 10 million people to come to Midrand. It's now impossible. But it always seems to be it's the chosen few who come to speak for the majority. And as things look at the moment, I still, there's this contradiction that seems to exist between how do you get a union, which represents people that are employed, to come speak for people that are unemployed. So that contradiction always seems a bit funny to me, that it's never quite resolved.
So you say the summit effectively needs to come up with a new plan to move us out of this quagmire that we find ourselves in regarding unemployment and joblessness. But what did the old plan say? I
think I've always said this. What is the plan? I think we have to be very honest. I think last time we were here, we were told there's an NDP. I think we put that to shreds. There is no plan. So it seems to me that for the last 2 decades, we've been doing the same thing when it comes to employment. And I always say this is not the sexiest topic to speak about, because as someone who was once unemployed, I can tell you I've got my own definition of unemployed. It's having the ability and the knowledge to know that you can work, but not being given the opportunity to do it. And I think it's so sad that the majority of, especially young people, are faced with that problem. And it seems for 2 decades, we've been told the same thing. And I don't know how we go to these summits again and we keep speaking and speaking, but we're not really drilling down to say, listen, what is the actual problem? There's no quick fix, because we've left it for so long now that there will not be a quick fix. And what sacrifices do we have to make? Because I think the longer we leave it, the more open we are to sacrifices, which I unfortunately have to say are going to leave a lot of our people in a more depressing situation.
Well, speaking of young people, and this is a very worrying one, you have, according to statistics, 52.4% of young people in South Africa unemployed. So this is, of course, a very serious situation. Earlier in the year, the President, he launched the Yes Initiative. How has that helped? And also the stimulus package that was introduced 2 weeks ago. Are those, measures that could make some sort of inroads into especially youth unemployment? I
think when it comes to these topics, I could tell you about the numbers. I could tell you it's not working. But the simplest way I always look at it is that when I go home to the Vaal, especially to Everton, when I actually just look around, what's my casting? And you look at just the people that are just sitting around, and what's more, when you speak to them, it's the fact that there's so much hopelessness. And now, if you go to rural areas, I was in the Free State over the weekend around the Welkom area, and it's the same thing. So I could tell you about the numbers, but I think what everybody seems to know, even in our own families, we always have relatives, even siblings that are unemployed. It's not something which is being fixed. And we really do, I don't think government is really on top of this. And I don't really think they've got a solution to it. So yes, it's good to speak about stimulus, but it seems as though if you were to ask me the real empirical data, things are not working. And what's worse, even they don't seem to want to acknowledge that things are not working, actually come up with new solutions.
But that's a serious indictment, because if you're saying government doesn't really know how to tackle this problem, then, is this 2-day workshop likely to turn into yet another talk shop, in your view?
And I think that's a great contradiction, that you have a job summit, but you don't even have the real players that are there. We haven't even, normally what's supposed to happen, I've never seen, South Africa as a nation, and I think our government is obsessed with speaking things into being. Now, I believe in the good word, and the Bible says you must always speak things into being, but for a government, that's not how things work. You should actually have a real life plan. And if you look at over the last 2 decades, we can go from GEAR, ASGISA, RDP, we have them all, and none of them have made a dent into this situation. So when I'm saying government is not working, I'm saying they seem to have a nice social club where they all meet and believe their way is the right way. And the majority of us who are excluded from these social clubs actually are seeing that things are not working, which really raises the question is, do they even want a solution? Or is it maybe, if one had to be very hard about it, do they really like the situation that they like playing savior to the rest of the masses on 2 day topics, but they don't really bring out anything? Because we can't say this is a secret. We all know unemployment is high in this country.
But of course, how would that be in government's interest, given that if you look at the social wage compact at the moment, you look at, for example, the grant system, that's not sustainable.
But that's not, they're saying only now it's not sustainable. The question would have been, when you were implementing this 2 decades ago, why did you not foresee that, listen, giving out grants in perpetuity is not the way to go? Now, when I'm saying it's in their advantage, I'm just being maybe a bit cruel in saying that, but it would seem to me that if you're not solving a problem, the next logical question to say, why aren't you solving it, and is it not in your interest to solve it? And one of the things that I want to raise is, listen, I'm not going to come in and tell you I've got all the solutions to it. We have to be humble enough to say, look, when it comes to issues of employment, it is hard, but we do know certain best practices work, and one of them is that you need a plan on the table. You need to actually know what is the problem. Is the fact, I know people keep saying unskilled. Well, most of us who started work will tell you we didn't go into work knowing everything. Even if you got a degree, you don't know everything. We learned on the job. So the question seems to be, are we actually speaking to the real industries to say, listen, why don't we actually make a compact to say, what is it that you need as an industry? What do you need from me as government to tell you I'm going to help you in this industry? And one of the things that seems to come out, and it's a problem that goes back to 1994, is that employees and employers don't trust each other. It has to do with our racial composition in our history. I find it very hard, and you even have to speak to unions. When you speak to them, they'll tell you, I find it very hard to trust somebody who is of a different pigmentation to me, that they're going to do the best for me. And this is something we should have really tried to get at the heart of, to say, why can't employees and employers trust each other? Because it's a very adversarial role. If you look what happens in Germany. Germany says, listen, we need to have our workers on board so that workers can actually see that, listen, when I make a profit, we share the dividends. Now, I always believe that as a private person who's in industry, I should be able to get the majority share because I'm taking the majority of the risk. But at the same time, we should also include workers to really see that, listen, when the company does well, you do well. And those are not the conversations which are happening in this country. It seems to be that we seem to believe that we're going to come, speak, do the same thing we're doing over and over, and something's going to happen. But what we really need to do is to sit down with employers and actually look at it this way and say, what can we actually do where we have to all compromise? It cannot be that you're a CEO who earns X amount of money, and yet you forget that the people who actually are working for you are making the company work are actually excluded in this. And more secondly, I think maybe this is going to be more of a challenge, we actually need to really look at the way our policies and institutions work. Do we really have things that promote you, let's say somebody who's unemployed coming in to work? Because if you look at the way the composition works, for you to actually come to work, that's about 50-60% of your salary. Now, we all know the petrol price has gone up. That is where government was supposed to come in to say, why don't we have public transport to make sure that if you're working in what's called apartheid spatial planning, at least we can cover your costs of transport. By that, I mean we actually have a public transport system. Taxis are not public transport, it's a private industry. And that's why I think we need to actually get right down to the root of the problem. And the longer we wait, the worse it's going to get, because we're seeing now internationally machines are going to come in. And that's something which I think this conference is not even speaking about. So I'm saying that there's a lot of things, and I don't find that this is really going to do much for helping people.
But it's something that the conference realistically cannot get away from, because in a recent World Bank report, they actually highlighted the need for infrastructure development in South Africa, as well as, education, and something needs to be done there. And the point you just made about the fourth industrial revolution speaks to our education system, because one of the other points that I see several commentators have also touched on going into the summit is the fact that we need to deal with the reality of the job force that we have as opposed to the job force that we want. And the job force that we have right now is largely unskilled.
And this is where we need to make the sacrifices. And I always say, look, it's wrong of me for someone who is in this position to be able to say, listen, you who's working in a factory, who's making less than 5,000, have to make a sacrifice. That's an indictment on our lack of leadership. The fact that after 20 years, people still have to make that sacrifice. But unfortunately, if you look at the way capitalism works, and you look at the way industry works, they come to where they believe they can get the maximum profit. And the only way we're going to actually entice them to come to this country is to actually have to sit down with people that are at the worst of the situation and say what sacrifices could be made. And because we've left this problem to linger for so long, that's where we really don't have, like you're saying, we don't have a situation. You can't take somebody who doesn't quite understand how mechanization works, put them into an industry of banking. It's just impossible. You need to put them in an industry where they are comfortable, where they can get the requisite skill to be able to upskill themselves. And this talks about sacrifice. And the sad thing is, it's going to be the same people that have been suffering who are going to be asked to make the largest sacrifices. Interestingly,
you also touched on the trust deficit between employers and employees. But if you look at the fact that South African business is not investing in South Africa, would you say that that is also due to a trust deficit between business and government?
This is where, again, it's an issue of leadership. If you actually look at the composition of corporate South Africa, because I have to make the distinction between corporate and people who are just trying to start small to medium enterprises, one of the biggest indictments has been that we've got monopolies. After 20 decades, we've only got the big four, the big five banks, and the big four insurers. One of the things that should have been done is to actually break them up, because they're actually stifling investing in the country. By that I mean, if you're a business owner, you actually need that capital maybe to upskill yourself. To go to a bank, they ask for your liver, your heart, and everything else. And it's because they've been allowed to become a monopoly. So one of the things that we should look at is that, yes, they're not investing because they'll give you the reasons why. And sometimes a bit dubious of those reasons, because if you look at what happened to GEA under President Thabo Mbeki, President Thabo Mbeki gave them the freedom of South Africa, yet they still didn't invest in the country properly. So sometimes the reasons, I think, are a bit wishy-washy. What we actually need to look at is to say, if we really want to look at total overhaul of the system, we need to look at corporate sector and say, listen, have these monopolies become too big? It happened in the United States where there was a dominance of one company, the Rockefeller company, in terms of it was oil, and they actually had to break it up, and this actually helped the American economy to grow. And I think that's where we need to be, because unfortunately, if we allow them to basically dictate all the time that, listen, we don't trust government, we don't trust government. Most people say they don't trust government, but we also have to ask, listen, what more can we do? Because we've given you most things you want, but it seems as though you're very happy to sit on your cash rather than invest in the economy.
So a lot has been said about foreign direct investment also to boost economic growth. But if your own businesses are not willing to invest in your economy, why should foreign investors, take the bait?
And I think that speaks to the heart of the problem, that those who have money in the country don't want to invest. Those who want to come into the country have no idea what's happening. And this just maybe speaks to an issue that I've been touching on a lot with my students. It's an issue of, look, in the modern economy, the key currency is going to be ideas. Whether you like or dislike America is really not the issue, but what makes the American economy work is the basis of ideas. And I think this is where we've been lacking in how we look at solutions and how we look at problems. We don't actually promote great ideas thinking. And that's why we keep going. That's why even though we need FDI is saying, what does South Africa have that I can invest in? What's that new big idea that's going to make the world catch fire? And I think until we really have an overhaul, which includes people like myself who are in education, because the thing is, we keep saying education, but no one actually drills down to say, look, the problem with education is the fact that we're producing people that are not critical enough and are not able to actually imagine what a new future is going to look like. And that's not something you can fix in a 2-day conference. That's something which we should actually have a proper discussion about and say, listen, how do we now sort out the problem that we're producing students already in the system and we can't help them? This speaks to the issue of teachers. I was telling a friend last night that one of the things that surprised me is that the reason why China is starting to catch up with America in terms of ideas, not in terms of raw factories, in terms of ideas, is they actually have one of these rules in Macau province where they say, listen, if you're a teacher, after 5 years of teaching, we as a state are going to make sure that you go overseas, whether you go to the US or you go to China, to actually upskill yourself more as a teacher. Now, we're talking about having an all teaching workforce, and we're not even speaking to them saying, listen, how do I upskill you to teach what's now coming in terms of students? Because whether we like it or not, South Africa is actually very small in the world economy. The only thing that's going to make South Africa big in terms of employment, in terms of making this country work, is ideas. And the fact that we're not at the cutting edge of ideas says to me that we're going to be behind, and the people that are going to suffer the most, again, is going to be people in rural areas, in townships, and I think the supposed middle class, which is already suffering under a lot of debt at the moment.
I mean, listening to you, your critique is, valid for the most part. But what would this summit need to deliver? What sort of document do they need to walk out of there with in order for the South African public to believe that there is, in fact, hope?
I think it's a dicey one. My mum always says, stop being that person who's negative on TV. So I'm going to try to be positive this time around and say what they do need to deliver. I think, firstly, just a message of humility. Look, listen, you can't solve everything. Pick one or two things which we can solve. One of the quickest things we can solve is to actually get the private sector on board to say, listen, we don't trust you, you don't trust us. Some of the reasons you give for not investing are not really solid. But if we actually had to quantify the problem of unemployment, had to quantify what you guys can contribute, what can you do? And I think most CEOs who also don't want to leave this country would actually be forced to come to the table. Secondly, we actually need to look at our government. And one of the things when I look at government is, let's stop putting people and institutions in place that don't have the requisite skills to actually deal with this problem. At the moment, we are told that this summit is led by NEDLAC, under the presidency, but where's DTI in this? Where's economic development? Where's the Ministry of Small Business in this? So one thing government can do is get the house in order. Stop speaking with multiple mouths at the moment where we're confused as to who's doing what. Come up with one voice. Tell us which ministry is going to be handling the problem of economic development and unemployment. If they can come up with those two things, even I, who's a critic, will say, listen, that is positive. Anything they're going to come up with, which adds, which is A, B, C, D, I think is just playing with people's hearts, and I think we're a bit tired of it now.
And of course, inequality, and that is at the heart of all of this. And I think for me personally, this is what we always run away from, because it's such a difficult thing to drill down and actually find solutions to. But we are arguably one of the most, if not the most, unequal society in the world. So again, how far does this summit need to go to once again make inroads in that regard?
When I was looking at the concept note, like you're saying, it doesn't touch on the concept of inequality. And I think it maybe speaks to the issue that I think they've kind of debased what it means to be unemployed and what it actually means to the larger collective. Sometimes statistics are nice, I believe in it, I'm an empirical researcher, but sometimes, like you're saying, the issue of somebody not being able to foresee a future for themselves beyond what they're currently living in. And I think that's what's currently missing at the moment. And when I was looking at the concept note, that's not even touched on, I think.
So 2 days, and of course I think we should come back and review whatever went on here. But 2 decades, as you yourself pointed out, of stubbornly high unemployment rates, currently officially at 27, just over 27%, and at the expanded notion around 40%. This is what they have to grapple with at this particular conference. But perhaps if you were one of the advisors sitting there, what would you say to President Ramaphosa just in closing?
I think have the humility to be able to say, listen, this government has not done great work for people that are unemployed. Secondly, have the humility enough to say, listen, let's stop this whole politicking around and actually look at what's really causing it. And this is going to have to mean sitting down, coming up with one coherent document which you and somebody on the street can basically agree, saying, listen, you finally actually hit the nail on the head here. That's the only thing I'd ask of him.
TK, thanks. Great speaking to you as always. That was TK Pooe, who is, of course, here to talk to us about the 2-day job summit that kicks off in Midrand today. And that brings us up to news time. Leanne standing by.